I'm Phil Spokane, VP of Professional Services at Intellitect. I'm going to go ahead and introduce you. Shawn is a senior software engineer at Intellitect. Previous to Intellitect, Shawn made a career of asking challenging questions at Intellitect meetups and seminars. And then he joined Intellitect, and now he's presenting. So now you can ask Shawn your excellent questions, and he'll do a great job answering them. Shawn hosts a really good podcast on .NET, Adventures in .NET, and also if you don't get a chance to ask Shawn your questions tonight, you can also tweet at him. He's the .NET superhero or .NET superhero. So you know what that means. When your next .NET disaster strikes, you tweet him. Tweet at Shawn.
Everyone here should hopefully be in the right place for the ABCs of Angular. We, again, Spokane.NET Users Group. We're sponsored by Intellitect. This user group, we meet the second Tuesday of every month. Our next meetup, hopefully you found us from meetup.com. And since we've already introduced Shawn, I am going to let Shawn take over.
Well, welcome to another episode of Adventures in No, wrong show. This is the ABCs of Angular. Hi, everybody. I'm Shawn Clabo, and we'll get you into the ABCs of Angular. This is just going to be an intro to Angular. It's not going to cover everything because there's just way too much to cover with Angular because it is a really big platform and framework. So we won't cover everything, but we'll give you the basics to understand what you need to get started and go through all of that stuff. So the first question that everybody wants to know, and you probably already know this, is what is Angular? And so really Angular is a platform. It's not just a framework because it really works with desktop apps, mobile apps. They're even working towards making it things that are more like installable apps on your desktop. So they're really kind of making it much broader than just a JavaScript framework for building mobile and desktop apps. So, and one nice thing about it, and it's kind of what led me to it, is that it's led by an Angular team at Google. So about 6 or 7 years ago when I first started with Angular, I was looking for something that really wasn't going to be something that might just drop off at some point in time. So I saw that this was being developed by Google, so I figured it would stay around, even though they are known for occasionally giving up on things. I don't think they're going to do that with Angular because they do use it widely within the company. So a lot of their products that you'll use on a day-to-day basis are built in Angular. So I don't think it's going away anytime soon. So I feel good with it. And also with Angular, a lot of the concepts were very similar to what I had done in the past. So even though Angular is a JavaScript framework and platform, you don't actually write JavaScript, which was really appealing to me because I really didn't like having nested functions and callbacks as functions and things like that you had to deal with JavaScript. And then also, it was really hard to refactor things because it really didn't know where you were using things in different parts of your program. So with Angular, you actually write TypeScript, and that gets transpiled into JavaScript. So, and I like TypeScript because it's a strongly typed language, but it also is a superset of JavaScript. And what I mean by superscript is that JavaScript is valid TypeScript. So if you have some JavaScript out there and you want to use it, TypeScript recognizes it and will use that in its compilation at compile time and work just fine for you. So that shouldn't be a problem. If you do have some JavaScript that you want to integrate into an Angular project, it should just come over just fine into TypeScript. And then I also liked it because TypeScript is very C-sharpish. So you're dealing with classes, you're dealing with modules, you're dealing with fat arrow structures instead of nesting functions and function calls and things like that. So you start with TypeScript, and then you end up with JavaScript, and that's what's actually running in your browser. But you don't have to deal with the JavaScript at all if you don't want to. So starting off with a few Angular concepts before we get into some actual demos and writing some code. So the main overall thing that you need to know about Angular is that it deals with modules. And modules are just a context that contains all your components and services into functional units. And when you do make your first Angular app, it does start out with one base module called the app module. And that's what actually gets everything started. And off of the app module, it'll start loading other modules that you need to run your applications. So you'll typically have a whole bunch of modules in your application, but it has to have at least one, that app module root. All right, so this is kind of a diagram that you understand how modules work. So you'll have your app module. It can have multiple components in it. It can have multiple services, and then modules can communicate back and forth between other modules. So you might write your own modules and have it kind of compartmentalized into different services. So you're not having everything all in one giant module, but you also might be using some third-party modules that you'll pull in. There's other ones out there, you know, by Telerik and some other companies that are good to work with Angular. So any of those will work just fine. So next thing after modules is components. So every Angular application has at least one component. So when you start up and make a new Angular application, it's going to build a module and it's going to give you at least one component, because that's going to define the first class that it gets everything started for modules. And in that component, a component is made up of an HTML template and a class which contains all your logic code to go along with that template. So the template and the class work interchangeably in between each other. So the module class is affecting the template, and then the template is actually affecting the model that you have inside that class. So we'll see a lot of that as I start get programming. So to make something a component, you start out with a class, and then you'll add a component decorated. And real key there is the parentheses after component. So for the decorators within Angular, almost always you'll see that the decorator is followed by the open and close parentheses as the decorator around a class, and so on and so forth. So that's with the components there. And to kind of describe what components are compared to other frameworks, if you've worked with web forms, and I've worked with web forms for a long time, the template is kind of like your ASPX, your ASCX files. The code behind for a web form is kind of like the class that's in Angular, and then these will all have CSS files for styling and things like that. If you're talking about more modern stuff with .NET Core, then you'll be talking about Vue components or maybe even Razor components, and those are your CSHTML and your Vue component class, and then again that'll also use CSS. So these are always in the templates, usually a mixture of HTML and other instructions that are come along with the framework to actually interact with the model and that template. So an example down below, in Angular, you'll have the double curly brackets with like a date now, something like that. In web forms, you would have the less than % and then equals date time. And then like in a Vue component, you're going to have your @ symbol and then some instructions, things like that, like date now. So that's like that there. So this is kind of a real simple introduction to what a component structure is going to look like. With TypeScript, you're going to have a lot of import statements. So at the top, you're going to bring in elements from other libraries or modules. You'll start with that add component, and then this is going to have parentheses, but then inside the parentheses is going to have some kind of parameters or options that you're going to pass into that component. So in this component, we're passing in a selector, which is called tab bar, and then the template is just your normal HTML. And you can have a template in line like it does here, or usually when you're working with the Angular CLI, it's going to have a template that's actually in a separate file. And I prefer having things separate. But if you did have something really, really small, you could put it in line that like it has there. All right, the next concept to understand in Angular is data binding. So Angular supports two-way data binding, and what I mean by that is that you can bind something from the template to the model that's in the class and from the model to the template. And as things change in either one, it will affect the other one. Now, a lot of people call this two-way data binding, but I really call it double one-way, because when you see the syntax of binding in Angular, you'll understand that there's one direction going into the class and the component, and then there's another direction coming out of the component into the template. So the next diagram I here kind of shows you how that works. So in the DOM, in the HTML, you can bind to things in Angular in 4 different ways. You can have the double curly brackets, and that will bind something from the component, which is your model, up into the DOM, the HTML. Or you can also put that same type of binding in the square brackets, referencing a property name of an HTML element, and then say that equals to the value that's in the model. So this should all make sense as we go through and get into some examples. The other way, if you want to bind from the DOM into the model, is you actually use the parentheses. And so you'll see something where there's an event that happens in the DOM, and then that's going to feed into a handler function that you have that's in the component. So that's going to go DOM to component. The first 2 were for component to the DOM. The other way, which is what is kind of simulating two-way binding, is the last example I have there, and that's ng model. And you notice that that has both parentheses and the square brackets equals to some property. Now, a lot of people call that square brackets and then the parentheses inside, they call that banana in a box. So that makes it really easy for you to remember which one goes inside which, because you can't do it the other way. You can't have the parentheses in the outside and then the square brackets. You have to have square brackets, parentheses, and then the ng model, and that'll bind things both ways. So if something changes in the DOM, that'll change the property in the component, or if somebody changes the property in the component, that'll update the DOM where that ng model is specified at. All right, next concept is pipes. And this is not too hard to comprehend, but it's a lot of times when you're dealing something in the template, it's not in the format that you want. And you could just put it in the class where you can change the format and do things like that. But Angular makes it real easy to change certain things in the template without having to worry about it in your code. And these are built in, so they'll have pipes like date, and it has some examples there. So in my template, in my HTML, I'm having a parentheses. Today is some date. But if I wanted to format that differently, I wanted it to be a full date, then I'd use the vertical bar as a pipe, and then I'd space date colon, and then in a string, full date. Or if I just wanted the time portion out of that date part of the today variable, then I would use short time. So the nice thing about pipes is they're very performant. So since they're built into Angular, if you want good performance, definitely take advantage of the pipes instead of trying to do it all yourself, where it has to compile that and do it on your code rather than within the actual framework itself. The next concept is called directives, and directives are very similar, I guess, to pipes, but since the templates that you're dealing with Angular are dynamic, when Angular renders them, it's going to transfer all that into instructions given by the directives. So a directive is very much like a component, but the difference is that instead of using the @component attribute, you're going to be using the @directive decorator, okay, attribute, and that's going to go on your class. And directives do not have templates, so you're just going to have this sitting right on the class itself. And then in Angular, there are 2 types of directives. And these are mostly talking about types of directives that are included with Angular. So the first type of directive to understand is a structural directive. So structural directives are going to alter the layout of your page, your HTML, by adding or removing or replacing things in the DOM. So the example that I use here is using two built-in structured directives, and it's going to add logic to the view how it's rendered. So the first structural directive you see here is this asterisk ng4, and that ng4 is basically going to loop through the elements that are in the heroes collection. So in this example in the class, there would be a heroes collection or an array, and this is going to make one li item per hero in the heroes array.
And Shawn, we have a couple questions coming in. Meg would like to know if you can pipe into custom functions, not just the built-in ones.
Can you pipe into custom functions? You can write your own pipes. So that would be your own function. So you can create your own pipes, and I do recommend that a lot. And it's at the end of the slides, I talk about what to do for getting better performance. And if there's something that you're doing over and over again as a function in your class and you want it to be performant, convert it to a pipe, because pipes will actually have its own built-in caching mechanism, and that will really help you out with making things work better with Angular, make it much more performant.
Nice. And follow up to that, I believe it looks like anyway, Jason asks, can we create our own transformers or formatters to be used with the pipes or just the built-in ones?
I'm not exactly sure what he means by formatters, but you can chain pipes together. So if you needed to chain, multiple things together from a date and maybe some other function that you had, you can chain them together. And what will actually come out in the HTML will be the final result once it goes through all these different pipes. So either write custom pipes that does everything and just use that, or you can chain pipes together.
And if Jason, if you need to put some clarity for that, if that didn't answer your question, feel free and we can follow up as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
So the other directive that I'm showing here in this slide is the ngIf, and that's basically a conditional. So it's looking for, a Boolean function or a Boolean value, or even in TypeScript, there's things that are either truthy or falsy. So like a 0, that to TypeScript or to JavaScript is falsy, and something that's not 0, like 1, 2, or whatever, that would be truthy. So you can do an ngIf on something that isn't absolutely true or false. You can just basically say, does this exist, or is it a non-zero type of thing? That would be true. Zeros or something that doesn't exist, that would be considered falsy. All right, go back to lost my focus here on my slide here. Controller, there we go. All right, so attribute directives. These are things that are going to be doing a lot of the bindings. So in the example here, I'm using ngModel. So that is an attribute directive. There are other attribute directives where you can actually manipulate things like attributes on HTML. You can work with key presses. You can work with like disabled elements on an input control. So there's all sorts of things. And these are typically the way to tell the difference between a structural directive and an attribute directive is that asterisk before the directive. So attribute directives are going to probably be either enclosed in the square brackets or within parentheses. And then structural directives, those are going to start with an asterisk. Okay. And we're getting through the last Angular concepts here, not too many more before we get started on the demo. So one thing that Angular uses a lot of, and you'll want to use as much as you can, is the concept of services. And this is going to be typically used as like a state. It's going to be used to call your state, or it might be used for like calling HTTP endpoints. So anything that can be that you want to be able to call or be used from multiple modules or multiple components in your application, you should probably set that up as a service. So it should be narrowly defined. It should have a purpose. So you don't want to have a lot of things within the service that are unrelated. So make sure things are you know, well related and isn't too, you know, really bulky. So don't get too much in there. Otherwise you can, you know, makes it really hard to maintain. All right. And now we're talking about dependency injection, and Angular is heavily used with dependency injection. It is key to providing the modules and services and things like that to your components. And one thing that I really like about Angular's dependency injection is any class can ask for any service or other module or element through that dependency injection. It doesn't have to be passed down from parent to child, things like that. Your component, you can just say from the dependency injection container, give me a copy of this service, or give me a copy of this value, or anything like that. So it's going to go right into it and be available within your component. And it also makes it really good and easy for testing, because one thing you can do in when you're setting up your dependency injection is you can say when the dependency injection, you know, like a component asks for this this service, don't give it the real thing, give it this fake or this mock or something like that instead. So in your unit tests, you can just write in the dependency injection setup, you can say, okay, give it this fake one. Don't give it the real one, because this is going to be in a test. And then Angular also does routing. So we'll show in my my demo how to set up routes, so that you can specify how to, you know, move from one component or one view to another view, and that'll be all done through routes. So it's really nice. And then you can retain, if you've got that state service that's handling everything, all of these routes can remember where they are, where they were, and where you left off when you go forward and back or move around within your application for Angular. All right, I think we're really getting towards the end here. The last thing, few things, is observables. Observables are a way to handle asynchronous operations. So a lot of the things that Angular will trigger as an event will be an observable. And if anybody's dealt with promises before, that means when you goes out and does something like an HTTP call and comes back, with a promise, there's just one response. In an observable, it actually keeps that connection open, is like watching to see if anything else happens. So it's like a stream. An observable is like watching a stream and having event handlers within C#. So when you have an event handler in C#, you subscribe to that event handler, and then every time that event gets handled or triggered, then your event handler gets notified of that event, and then you can handle it however you want within your code. And routing and forms and things like that use observables to listen to and respond to, you know, user input events and things like that. All right. So to get started with Angular, what do you need? Well, the first thing you're going to need is Node.js. And if you want to get Node, it's free. You can install it from nodejs.org. And that will also get you NPM. So when you get Node.js, that'll give you NPM. And NPM is the Node package manager. And that's how you're going to actually install a lot of third-party libraries and components to use in your application. Warning is right now, with the latest version of Angular and the latest version of NPM, there is an issue with it. So If you install Node and you've never installed it before, you don't want to install npm 7 right now. You do want to install npm 6. If you install npm 6, everything will install just fine. If you install npm 7 and then you say go ahead and install everything that Angular needs, it'll start giving you some errors. So do watch out for that. Once you have,
sorry to interrupt. We do
Go
have a question that just came in. Joseph was curious how you would handle state for large applications. Do you use Redux, Akita, built-in Angular state management, or something else?
I like to keep things simple myself, and I keep things into small service. I tend to write my own, but there are a lot of people that are using like NGRX for setting up real enterprise-like level state management services, and that's very common. So if you need something that's really large size enterprise, needs to contain a lot of state all at once, look into NGRX. I don't like to use that unless it really is called for, because there's a lot of overhead with it and there's a lot of setup and configuration to go along with NGRX. So once you've got Node and npm installed, then you can actually open up a command prompt, and wherever you are at, you'll be able to do an npm install and then install the Angular packages, Angular @Angular/CLI, and then you want to have the -G, and the -G tells it to be global. So it'll install the Angular CLI package into the global repository for you, so that you can get to the Angular CLI commands from anywhere that you're at. If you didn't install the -G, then it's only going to be available if you're actually inside that folder where you did the install. So the last recommendation or requirement that you need for Angular is a text editor, and that can be a VS Code, that can be something like WebStorm, Sublime, or even full-blown Visual Studio. You can do that within Visual Studio, and there is some templates they have for Angular. Sometimes they're a little bit outdated, so I recommend just using Visual Studio Code for starting your Angular application, and then for your backends, if you need your APIs, then using Visual Studio for all of that. And if you do use VS Code, there's some extensions I can recommend. If you look for the Angular Essentials, there's a pack of extensions that come along with that, and there's about, I don't know, 8 to 10 different extensions that includes, and you can pick and choose which ones of those that you want, but most of those are very helpful with doing Angular development. You also might want to look into Visual Studio Key Map. That's if you want to use VS Code and you're familiar with the key shortcuts within Visual Studio. If you get the Visual Studio Key Map, then everything should be pretty close to being the same for you. And then I also recommend using Angular schematics, and I'll show you that in my demo. And that really makes it a lot easier to do building of components and services and routing right from within VS Code without having to go to a command prompt and enter in the commands there. There is an alternative, so if you do want to play around with Angular and you don't want to install Node.js and the Angular CLI and an editor, you can check out stackblitz.com. It is basically like having VS Code in a browser, and it will actually have starting points where you say, okay, I want to build an Angular application, and it will install everything you need to get started with Angular right there in the browser, like VS Code in the browser. So it's really cool and real handy. And then if you make something in StackBlitz and you say, well, now I want to work in that locally, it does have the ability to download the entire package into deliverable, something that you can download into your machine, and then open up VS Code and continue working on it from there. So that's really nice and handy. All right, so it's demo time. Let me switch over to my desktop. And let's stop my slides for a second. All right. And can everybody see my desktop now? Can you see it, Aaron?
I see it. It's kind
All
of
right.
small though.
Yeah, can you make it bigger?
Okay. The font or the window? Want the font bigger? We'll try that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's hard. I have big screens, so it's sometimes hard to tell what it looks like for other people.
Right.
All right.
And my view is different than our any of our viewers. So if anyone's having an issue seeing it even now, please just let us know in the comments and we can adjust.
All right, cool. All right, so I've gone through the setup. I've installed Node, I've installed NPM, and now I have Angular CLI. And the latest version that I've installed is Angular CLI version 11. So, and I'm working on Node 14, and I'm a Windows machine. So when you install the Angular CLI, it's going to give you these packages. So that's the essentials for working with Angular. So the first command that you use to get started with Angular is ng. So if you want to just make sure everything's working, just do ng-version, and that'll make sure that the Angular CLI commands are in your path, and that'll tell you that everything is working. And that -g, put it into the global, environment for you, so you should be good to go there. And then the first thing that you want to do is create a new project. And you do that by going ng new, and then give your project a name. So I'm going to name mine demo project. Okay. Okay. So it's going to ask you a few questions. And the first one is, do you want to enforce stricter type checking and stricter bundles in your workspace? So it's going to give you an option here. Do you want to be really strict with your typing and your templates and everything there, or do you want to be a little more flexible? The default is no. So if you're just starting out, you might want to start out with no as strictness, and go from there. Okay. The next thing is, do you want to add routing? So if you're going to have a multi-page application, you probably want to add routing. So I'm going to say yes here instead of the default for no. Then it gives you an option of how are you going to define your CSS? Do you want to use just plain CSS? Do you want to use SCSS, LAS, or SAS, LESS, and stylus? I prefer to use SCSS. And the nice thing about this is with the Angular CLI, when you go to build things, it automatically compiles your SCSS or your SAS, your LESS, or your stylus all for you. So you don't really have to worry about running that and setting up some other package to process to build those things first before you build your Angular project. So it's going to go through and it's going to create your project, and then it's going to install your packages. And my connection here, it should take just maybe about a minute or so. So it would be a good time if anybody has any other questions to send them in now while my machine is going out there and installing the packages.
And we do have one that just came in from Esther. If you choose not to use Angular routing, what would you use?
Then you're actually going to have to either make everything one page. So you would show and hide elements of your page, maybe your components. You'll have one component as one view, another component as another view, and you'll show and hide those just on a single page. Or what I've done before is in an old MVC project that I had, I wanted to use, the MVC authentication providers and things like that. So I actually had my Angular views, the templates all sent up by my MVC views. And then in my components, I would actually cause the browser to redirect just like I would in a normal MVC application. I would redirect over there. The downside to that is you're pretty much going to have to make sure that every page has its own state and refreshes its own state, because you're going to be jumping between one page to another, and that's actually going to reload the whole application. And so anything you had within your state service, if it wasn't saved somewhere, either into local storage in the browser or into a database in the back end, then you would have to go out and pull that back in from local storage or SQL Server. So you can do it that way. All right, so ignore the warnings here. This is just talking about carriage return and line feed. So now I'm going to go into my demo project, and I'm going to open up code. What? All right. I'm going to open up this way. Access denied. I'm an administrator on my machine. Don't tell me access denied. All right. So now I'm going to open that folder. All right. So here's what the Angular CLI built for me. It has my entire, what I need to get running with Angular and that project. So I'll go through a little bit of this. So a lot of this down here, this tsconfig, this is all about your TypeScript. It's going to talk about, what do you want to have your end result be? Is it going to be ES 2015? What version of JavaScript do you want the Angular CLI to build when it's all done? So ES 2015, this is something that's very common in your modern browsers. So it will be a lot more performant if you use ES 2015 rather than something like ES5, which is what your older browsers would need to use. Okay.
We do have another question coming in. Seth would like to know how often are breaking changes introduced. For example, how hard is it to keep your project up to date on the latest version of Angular? I know the cadence for the new versions is fairly quick.
Yeah, they are very, very quick. So, and they have an update guide out there for you. So if you want to find out about upgrading from one version of Angular to another, go out to update.angular.io. Make this bigger. And then you can pick what version that you're going to be going from. So if I went from 9 to 11 and I have a medium complex app, and then say show me, and then it gives you the steps down here. Now the nice thing is that it seems like a lot of steps here, but a lot of these things you probably won't need to worry about, because some of those are just in very specific situations. So usually you can get away with just doing one command, and that's this command here. So this ng update Angular core Angular CLI will typically do 90 to 95% of the upgrade of Angular that you need. So if you're at least Angular 8, it's very easy to go to Angular 11. 8, 9, 10, 11, those are very easy to do upgrades. Before 8, they made a number of breaking changes. So if you needed to go even from 7 to 8, it can end up being a lot of manual changes that you have to go in and update your templates to a different syntax, or even some of your HTML, your services. If they're calling out to HTTP, those might take a little bit more work. But since then, upgrades have been very, very painless for me, and I tend to keep up with the changes. And I'm not quite bleeding edge, but I like to be cutting edge. So going from, like just a couple of weeks ago, I moved the project from Angular 10 to Angular 11. There was one issue that I had to wait for them to work out. It just took about a week or two, and they had an update, and then I just ran that command, and that was all I had to do. I didn't have to touch my code at all. Once the library's updated, then it just worked. Now, the other thing you have to keep in mind is you're not always just looking at your code. You might be using a third-party library. So you always want to check with those third-party providers before you update your project to make sure that all of their code is compatible with this update, because sometimes they might be doing something very, very specific, and it might not be ready for that Angular version that they just came out with. So always check your third-party providers before you do an update.
And Meg also has a question about Angular. Does it have a built-in UI framework, or do you have a favorite UI framework to use with Angular?
I think you're probably using like a CSS framework. I've always just been using Bootstrap. They do have one called Angular Material. So if you do like the look of a lot of the Google applications, search Google search for Angular Material, and it will give you the buttons that, like, when you click on it, it has this little burst of color behind it and things like that. So I would go with either Bootstrap or Angular Material, because those are two very common CSS frameworks or libraries that a lot of the third-party vendors will also support. So when you install something from like Telerik, you can also install it with Bootstrap support, or you can install it with Angular Material support. So you can get that consistent look and feel between the stuff that you build and something that you're going to be getting from a third party. Okay. So this is all this here. This was, like I said, TypeScript configuration. I want to make sure that I do not have strict mode turn on. And it looks like they don't, because I said I did not want strict mode, so that's good. Package JSON. This is telling you everything that Angular installs to run your project. So it's going to install TypeScript. It's going to, this Protractor and Karma and Jasmine, these are all unit test libraries for creating unit tests. Codalizer, this is something that'll actually tell you, how much your code is taking up your final package. So when you build your application, you want to say, okay, here's all my build files, my JavaScript files that are going to publish out. Is there ways that I can trim it down? You can use Codalizer to tell you, how much of the final result is being used by what. And then a lot of these things here, these other things are just the actual Angular libraries itself. So, and here's some common commands that you can use for starting your application, for building your application, or from testing. E2E, this is end-to-end tests. So you'll notice there is an end-to-end E2E folder up here. So when I did that ng new and it built my project, it does make an E2E folder, and this is where you can start building end-to-end tests. I won't get into that tonight because that's kind of a little bit more advanced. It's not in the ABCs of Angular. Node modules, you'll find this ends up being huge, and there's no way about it. Really, this is saying that when I install something, it has dependencies, and then that dependency has further dependencies, and so on and so forth. And that's what it's going to go into your node modules folder. It's just ignore the node modules folder. Don't mess with it. You don't want to, tinker with it unless you really know what you're doing, because when you do an update to a third-party library, something like that, a lot of that's going to get overwritten. So if you try to make any changes to node modules, it's likely that it's just going to be overwritten whenever you do another update or an install of something into your packages. So ignore node modules. If you're using a source code provider, you don't want to make sure that your node modules folder is excluded. So you don't want to check that into your source code, because that will get rebuilt every time you install your application and then you do an npm install. So the npm install command says, okay, make my node modules folder and install everything that this application needs. So where we're going to be working today is primarily in the source, the SRC folder. And this stuff down here is basically just bootstrap stuff. This is a global style sheet. So if you want a style to be everywhere in your application, you can enter that into your styles. That, in my case, SCSS. You might be using styles.css if you're just writing pure CSS. Polyfills and main, this is bootstrapping stuff. And then index.html, this is all it is. This is all you need in your index.html to get your Angular application running. And in fact, when I built this, created this application, it created that first module that you need. Remember, I said every application has to have one module, and that's the app module. And the Angular CLI created that for me, and that's what this index.html is going to use. So I'm going to come back to my command line.
Let me interrupt you really quick. Meg just had a follow-up to a previous. She said she's used to Vue, which typically uses Vuetify, and she wasn't sure if there was something similar to be used.
Vuetify. I've not done Vue, so I'm not certain about Vuetify. Is that UDEFY or UDFY?
VUETIFY. If anybody happens to know, you're welcome to reply to Meg's comment there as well.
Oh, that's basically the material design that I mentioned for Vue. So okay. So if you're looking for material design, that's that Angular material that I mentioned. So you can get that same look that you did with Vuetify by getting Angular material. Yep.
Thank you.
You can do that. All right. So ng serve. I've not written a line of code yet. All I've done is ng new in my project. And this is going to start up real quickly. The first time you compile is going to take a little bit longer than the next times, because Angular does do some intelligence to figure out what's already been compiled previously and what changes. And then the next time you do a compile, it doesn't need to do the same full compilation that it did before. And so when I did this ng serve, it's basically created these files for my application. So there's a vendor file, there's a polyfills file, there's my styles, there's my main, and my runtime. So this is the Angular runtime that it needs to get started up. And since this is very small, this end result might seem a little bit big, 3.4 megabytes, but this is not a protection build. So it doesn't try to, tree shake out or remove all the unused code from the Angular library that it doesn't need when I'm just doing a development build. So if I then come to, it says, go to localhost :4200. then here's what I have. So just by doing that, it's giving me this kind of a sample application introduction page for Angular. And it, just has some links here if you want to learn more about it. But this is just kind of your starting point for your Angular. So let's move that aside, and then we'll go back to my application. So
while you're doing that, I did want to just say, for those that aren't following along in the chat, Steve wanted to point out a buyer beware comment that most component libraries, Angular, React, etc., have a lot of baggage. They'll get you 80% of the way and 20% of the time. Thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah. So that's nice. One thing that, that's good and bad about Angular is it's very kind of opinionated. Instead of like React doesn't have a lot of things included right out of the box. So with React, you get to pick and choose your own router. You can pick all sorts of different libraries that you can use with React. Angular comes with a lot of that stuff already in the box. You can switch out to something else. So you could use some third-party router with Angular, but the ones that they have in the box are pretty good. And so a lot of people don't find a need to switch out. One thing that they don't really have that's in the box is that good state management service. There's NGRX or things like that, but it doesn't really have something for that. But as far as routing, as far as handling your styling, your tests, things like that, a lot of that comes right with installing Angular, the Angular CLI. So it gives you a lot of that. So it has an opinion and it wants you to use that. And a lot of the community is using those things. So the best way to come up to speed is to stay with that. And then once you really kind of get familiar with things, then make that decision of whether or not you want to go to a third-party provider for routing or state management or anything like that. All right, so remember what my application looked like. So it was just this here. That is this. So in the app component.html, all of this is what built that page, and this was already there. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of this. I don't need this, not for our little demo here. And so all of that tells you it's got comments there. It says, okay, this is just a placeholder. Get rid of it. Okay, the only thing you want to make sure that you leave if you're using routing is this router outlet. And this tag here is needed so that Angular knows where to put your components. So this app component, is basically your root component that all the other components and page elements will get put into by Angular. And when it's running, Angular needs to know, okay, where do I put it? And it looks for this router outlet. So make sure you keep that if you're using routing. Okay. And then in my component, okay, there's really not a lot here for this, initial base component. It basically just set a title, and I don't need that either because I'm not using any of the things that they had in their HTML. Okay. Here's my component, my component attribute, that I'm going to tell it that this class here is an Angular component by using this @ component. And like we had in my slides, these are the options that I'm sending into this component. So it knows that the selector to use for if I wanted to have this component visible is app root. And if we go back to my index.html, what do you know? There's app-root. So Angular knew that in this HTML, index.html, I'm going to put my app component right there. So that's where things get started. And then if I wanted to have styles specific to this component, then I could look into the app component.scss file. And this is blank because I don't have any styles that I've written. specific for this app component. Okay, so if I show you what my app looks like now, it's just blank. There's nothing there. It is running though, so there is Angular running behind there, but there's nothing. I haven't built any components yet to tell it what to put into this, router outlet. So let's get started by building our first components that I'm going to need, and I'm going to do the first one through my command line. And when you're adding components, it's always best to stop your application from running. So sometimes it will not like to add components through the CLI or through the Angular schematics plugin that I'll show you in a minute. So stop that. And then I want to make a new component. So I'm going to make ng generate component, and then I'm going to put it in a components folder, and I'm going to call it login. Okay. Like that, the Angular CLI will create the files that it needs for this login component and put it in the components folder. Notice one nice thing is it also updated my app module. So as you add components to your application, the app module or whatever module that component belongs to needs to know about it. So the CLI, understands that dependency, so it's going to do that for me. So I'll show you over here in the app module. I now have a login component, importing my login component, and then here's my module, decorator, ng module. This is saying that this class is an ng module. And the options for this ng module are declarations. So this tells it what components that this module will be using. And then it also imports other modules. Now these are modules that are provided by Angular so that it needs to know how to interact with the browser. And also, since I said I'm going to be using routing, it also added the app routing module. So it brought those into my module because, modules can be used and shared between other modules. Providers, this is what's going to be used for our services once we create a service. So right now I don't have any services available, so I'm not going to add anything to my providers, option right now. And then this is telling Angular in this module what's the base component for this module. So the bootstrap component for this module is the app component. And within modules, you typically don't have anything within the class itself. You're just using this to declare and set that module up for all the components and services that you're going to have within it. So before I ran that command, this line wasn't there and this line wasn't there. So the CLI added it for me. Okay, so I've got now over here, I've got a components folder, and inside of that, I now have a login component. And it created an HTML that just says login works, created me a style sheet, and this is a test file. So if you want to look at kind of the beginnings of what unit tests look like within Angular, check out the spec files. And this is what the TypeScript and the Jasmine and Karma, TypeScript or unit test frameworks will use for its tests. So, but we're not going to get into tests, so I won't open that. And then here's my component. So here's my login component. Remember when I typed it in here, I just said, I want to create login. It automatically added components for me. So when you're creating a component, just give it the name. It will, suffix it with component. And then it sets up the selector. It's called app login. using the template URL, and URL says don't use, I'm not going to use an inline template. I want to use a file for a template. And so that's what this file here is. So this is my template for the login component. Okay. Nothing in my constructor right now. ng on init. This is one of the lifecycle, methods for Angular. So when Angular first creates an instance of your component, the first thing it's going to do is run this ng on init method, and it returns a void. And to get this to work, you have to make sure that you have this implements on init. So, and this is just basically just an interface that Angular has, and it brought it in up above. When it brought in the component, it also brought in the on init interface into this component here. All right, so there's another way I can create a shorthand for this. So if you don't want to type generate, you can just do ngg, and let's see, I want to component. I want to go in the components folder, and I'm going to make a page not found. So now I have in my components, I have a page not found component. And it's named here, and basically just, page not found works. Right. So I can keep on doing it through the command prompt, or if you've installed, VS Code, and you're working with VS Code, and you've installed the Angular schematics, that would be this icon here will tell you if you've got it up and running. Then what I can do is I can right click on my components folder and say, generate a component. All right, so some other components that I want to have today are, let's see, I want to have a products component. And then I'm just going to have this as a default component. These pure components, exported components, these are more like if you're doing a library, you'll use those, or if you're just going to have something that's a page in its own by its own and not associated with a route, then you can make it a page component. But I'm just going to start with default component and then say confirm. And that basically just does that ngg, command for me. So if I bring up my terminal, bring this back. Oh, it looks like it closed it. So that basically just issued that ngg generate component for me, and now I have a products component. And then let's do another one. So we're going to do components, and let's do product details. Then ngg component product details. All right. Move this away. So I have login, page not found, product details, products. Okay. For my demo purposes, I think that's enough. I now want to make a service. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to generate a service, and I'm going to have this go into services, and I'm going to make this a data service. So now I have a services folder and a data services, and you notice this is only two files. This is just the data service class and the data service test file. Okay, we're only concerned with the class right now, but you notice that this class as a data service isn't a component. It's not a module. It's called injectable. So this is what's letting Angular know that this is going to belong in the dependency injection of Angular, and you're going to be asking for this from time to time. So make it injectable for me. Okay. Provided in root, this basically says that this injectable, I only want it to be a singleton. So when I create this service, or I ask the dependency injection to create one, only create one. If I ask for it again, give me that one that's already been created. Don't create a new one. So provided in root, we'll set that up so that it's only a singleton service for you. All right. So I've got my components that I'm going to need for tonight, and I've got my services. One other thing I'm going to set up is the routing. So I want to make sure that I can navigate from one page to another and see the components that I need to move to, as I go through my application. So that's what the app routing is doing. And by default, it's going to create this app routing as its own module. And remember when I was back at the app module, it's importing the app routing module for me so that my app module knows about this routing. This routing could be hard-coded, so you wouldn't need to make it as a separate module, but it's much more convenient to have it out there as its own module. So if you need to share it between modules, you can do that. Okay, and again, it's doing the imports here. It's doing for root, which is kind of like what the data service was like. It's saying I only want one of these. Okay, so the router module, make it a singleton. It's only going to be available for the root, and pass it in these routes. And right now I don't have any routes configured. So routes is an array, and this array is going to be an array of objects. So if you're not familiar with JavaScript objects, it's basically kind of like a C# object, but you're going to declare it right in line here. And the first route that I'm going to have is this route to my login component. So the squiggly brackets, this says this is an object. This object has two properties, a path and a component. So the path is what's going to show up in the URL when I tell Angular to go to this route. So I'm going to tell Angular to navigate to my login route, and it says, okay, that's what I'm going to use for the path. And then when I go to the login route, I'm going to use the login component in that route. Remember back here, the router outlet? It's going to say, okay, I'm going to put that login component into that router outlet and then show it for people. Right now it says, I don't know what login component because I haven't imported. So with VS Code, I can go quick fix and then say import that. So now it's bringing that component information into this file for me so that I can use it in my routes. Okay, so I've got that one. I'm also going to need a route to products. Import that. And I'm going to need a route to details. So these are routes that I've specified to go to the 3 different components that I've made. I haven't put a route in for page not found because I'm going to show that a little bit differently than in this routing table here. And now I'm going to add a couple special routes to my routing, variable. I'm going to add 2 here. One is a path to nothing. So basically an empty string. So what's that saying is, if I'm not going to a route, if I just go to the root of my application, where do I want to take the user to? Okay. If you don't specify something as an empty string and somebody just go to, URL/, it's not going to know where to take them. So you want to include this empty space so they know where to go. And then this is going to say, okay, redirect to the login route. And path match is saying, make sure that they use the full, it's this full word. It's not a partial match. So I'm going to say, make sure that that's a full match. And so if they enter in just / the default route or page that they'll go to is the login route. And then this other one down here is like a catch-all. So order matters. So when Angular says, okay, I have a path here that somebody typed in the URL, where do I need to take them? It's going to start top to bottom. It's going to say, does the current URL match login? Yes, go to login. If not, then it's going to try the next one, and the next one. Well, I want to have a default that says, if none of those match, this is the wildcard match. This double asterisk, this will take them to the page not found component. So that's why I didn't put this up here as page not found, because I'm using page not found as that wildcard. Okay. This is, for my demo purposes, this is all I need for routing. If you have any questions on routing, yeah, let me know. If not, I'm gonna, did we have questions?
I don't have any right now, so just
Okay.
keep going.
Okay, all right. So my page not found component, I'm just gonna leave that at page not found. It's not gonna pretty much tell anybody anything other than that they didn't go to a page that they should have been going to. So the first component I'm really gonna start building is my login component. Okay. And I'm going to need a couple styles that I've created for this. So I'm going to add a style into my SCSS file for this component, basically just to give it a border and some sizing and padding. So nothing too special there. And then in the login component, I'm going to create my login. So what I'm doing here with my login right now is just HTML. So this, if I go back to start my application, see, that was much faster that time. So I bring back my application.
Hey, Shawn, Joseph would like to know if there's a way to pass data from one route to another.
There is. You can pass data in the URL just like you can with a normal query string type of parameter. And I will show that when we go from the products page to the products details page. So if you're just trying to pass small bits of data, you can pass that as query string values in the route. And like I said, I'll show you that in a little bit. If you need to pass more than that, then you're probably going to want to pass something to some sort of reference in your data service. So here's my application now. I said, okay, if I go to this, just to the root, take them to the login. So it redirects to /login. And then here's my username and password. And I can type whatever I want in there. And my button doesn't work. It doesn't work. That's because I have not hooked my button up to anything. And I'm not going to be adding more components or services. So I can actually just leave this running. And Angular knows that if I make any changes, it will automatically recompile. So if I say, I'm going to add a link on my template here. So I'm just going to add a link to my page not found. If I go back to this, it already refreshed before I could switch back to this window. And now I have this page not found link here. And so the keys here is so you can have an A tag and you can declare a link, a router link, and then what route for it to go to right in your HTML if you want to. So you don't have to go through your class to do any routing if you don't need to for some purposes. You can put a link right in your HTML, but instead of using href, you're going to use router link and then tell it which path to go to. And then this is basically just, letting it know which router link is active, and it'll keep that going for you. So if I go back here, I now have this here, and if I hit this, then I go to my page not found. So simple like that, simple links like that are just really, really easy to do. All right. So the next thing I want to do is I want to start hooking up my HTML, my template, to my component, the code behind my component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a couple of properties, variables in my component. So I want to set up username, and this is TypeScript, so I'm going to declare it to be a string. So colon, and then a TypeScript data type is how I declare things in TypeScript. And then I'm going to default that to empty string. So I have two, and these are public. So I could say, if I only want to use it within the class, I could call these private if I wanted to. But I'm going to use it in my template. So private means it's only used within the class. If I need it to be used outside of the class, like sometimes within the template, then you want to keep it public. And then here's where we're going to do a dependency injection. So within Angular, to pull things in from the dependency injection, you put them in the constructor as parameters. And here, what I'm going to need in my login class is the router, because once they log in, I need to then send them to another page. And I'm also going to use the data service class to know whether or not, they're logged in. And this is something I'll use in a short bit. So I need to bring in both of these. So VS Code will help me with that. I'll add both of these into my imports. So now it knows about router and data service. And I need a method. This is if I don't specify a type, then it's void. So leaving off a type is the same thing as doing this. Okay. And then I'm going to say oh, did I tell everybody my username and password now? Okay, well, that's all right. So I'm going to say if this username is user and this password is pass, then I'm going to say navigate to the products route. So if that's successful, okay, then I could do else. Sorry, I have to look over my camera if it looks like I'm trying to do things. My camera's in front of my screen. Let's add something else. And since this is inside a TypeScript class, you always have to prefix it with this. So invalid login equals true. And just to be safe, up there to be false if it was successful. So this is the class I need behind my template to do what I need. Pretty simple. Now, to get this to start interacting with my class, I have to start using data binding and event binding, those structural directives that we talked about in the slideshow. So in my component here, to bind this text box to my model, I'm going to use ngModel. And banana in a box. I'm going to bind this element to username. And it's complaining. Can't bind to ngModel since it isn't a known property of input. Well, yeah, in HTML, ngModel is not a valid property or attribute of input. So it's not, but it is for Angular. Why is it complaining? That's because we have not told Angular that we're going to be using ngModel in our application. So ngModel and things that deal with like interacting with the model are not included in the module by default. You have to tell Angular that this module is using forms. So if I go back to my apps module, okay, I'm going to bring in the forms module.
Seth also wanted to point out that it might be worth noting for those not familiar with TypeScript that adding the accessibility modifiers in the constructor makes them member variables in the class.
Right, right, very good. Okay, so I've added the forms module, and this is now it's going to quit complaining about what ngModel is. So now my application knows what ngModel is. I've got that there. Okay. So text is now bound to username, and I can prove that because down here I can say username. If I go back to my project, reload it, make sure it's it. So as I type here, you can see it starts showing up. So it's doing that two-way data binding because this, what I have down here, is coming out of the module, out of the components class. This is sending it into the components class, into that variable. So this double binding here is doing that for me. Remember, banana in a box, minions, right? As my wife would say, she loves the minions. All right, so we've got login component. We've got this one bound. Let's bind the other ones. So let's bind password to password. And then in this button here, I'm going to bind this to a couple different things. I'm going to first bind it to the disabled property of a button. So buttons have disabled. So I'm going to say I'm going to put this in square brackets so Angular knows to evaluate this and give it a result. So I'm going to say disabled. This button should be disabled if there's not username or there's not password. And these are, I'm using the falsy, equivalents here. So if it's empty, empty is false. So not false is true. And that will disable the button if there's no username or there's no password. But then I also want to do one more thing, and that's when they click the button, I need to do something. So when they click something, I need to call that login method. So this is an event. Click is an event that happens in the browser, in the DOM. So click, send that click event to the login method in that component. So, okay. So as soon as I click this, if they put in the username and password, it should navigate to products. So let's see where we're at. My login button is disabled. There's no username and password. If I just type something and I hit login, it doesn't work. If I type user and pass, then I go to the products page. Hey, Making good progress. So we got to log in. If a page not found, we can take that off. All right. Next, let's go and let's put together that products. No, let's put together our data class because we need some data to go along with our products page. So in the products list. So let's start off with this data class and let's give it a product list. So I'm making a product list and I'm declaring this as an iProduct. And this is an iProduct, an array of iProduct. And I've not declared this interface yet. So let me put in what that interface is. So outside of this export, because I'm only using this iProduct here, I'm going to put in my interface. And this is saying an iProduct is made up of an ID that's a number, a name that's a string, quantity that's a number, and a location that's a string. Now in TypeScript, if you want to have something that's optional, so like up here, if I got rid of one of these, it's going to complain. It's going to say property location is missing in type. Well, that's because location down here is not optional. To make something optional in TypeScript, you use a question mark. Now, optional, really the way I think about it is it's not the same as nullable, because I could keep it this way and I could do this. And the compiler won't complain. Oh, you give me a location? Okay, it's null. Okay, at least it's there, so I won't complain. So if you do want to have something that doesn't have this even declared, then you can add this question mark equals, and it becomes optional. But I'll keep it like this for right now. All right. So there's my products. And this is private, so this is only accessible within the class. I don't want people going straight to my product list and making changes. I only want them accessing this product list through methods that I'm going to make available in my data class, my data service class. So my first method I'm going to make is get products. And get products, when this is called from the data service, we're going to return this product list. And of, this is something that you use to make something an observable that's not really an observable. Now, normally, get products might call out to an API backend. And so instead of returning of and this product list, most of the time you're going to do something like this. You're going to say get products, and then in my constructor, I bring in the HTTP client service from Angular. So I'm just going to take a little tangent here and show you what, making an HTTP call. There was too many T's there. But to make the call out to a service, use HTTP client. You'll call this and then this is your method. So this could be a post. And then some data. Any kind of data to go along with that post, or it can be a get. So in this, most often you're going to be doing a get. And this is complaining about HTTP client because, again, this module does not know about HTTP. So if you want to use HTTP, then you bring in the HTTP client module.
And Shawn, we're getting close to our 8 o'clock time. Obviously, we started late, so I want to make sure you have time to finish, but I also want to honor my time commitment as far as the raffle goes. So I'm going to draw the raffle now and make sure I have time to connect with whoever wins. But do feel free to wrap up. And if anyone has any other questions, please ask them now or in the comments so we can make sure we have time to answer them. I'll also be posting links to the .NET and the DevOps meetups, and also to Shawn's the Adventures in .NET podcast that he hosts. Shawn, at some point, I'd love it if you could explain what exactly that is and what you talk about there. But before you do, just going to say I've got Meg. So I'm not on video. I'm holding it to a screen. So Meg has won, and I will get in touch with her about getting that link set up. But back to you, Shawn. Sorry about that.
All right. Congratulations, Meg. I think you'll enjoy that. It's a nice package. I need one of those. Can I win too? No.
Steve made a comment to Joseph that you can pass data between the routes. That looks like that might be from a previous comment.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so I brought in the HTTP client just so it would quit complaining about this. So that's how you call it HTTP, but for my demo, I'm just going to return this, and this is turning this into an observable so that back in my products page, I can do this. So I'm going to just kind of speed things up. I'm going to start putting in bigger snips of code. All right. So I'm going to import all these. So I've got a product list that I'm going to use in my product component. I'm going to be using my data service. I'm going to be using the router. So first thing first, on init's going to fire, and it's going to say this.data service.get products. And observables, you subscribe to them. So you're going to subscribe to that observable, and then when it gets a response, it's going to come back and say, okay, I'm going to take that response and shove it into the products list variable. If there's an error, then I'm going to console log the error. I'm also going to start adding, if the user's logged in, double checking that. And so I'll add that to my data service. So if you do have to cut out, we are going to make this a video, so you can catch the end of the video later. I realize we are going long because we got started late. So these are going to be variables in my data service there. And then I'm also going to have another method for my data service to get a product. So product details, that will bring that in there. Should be building just fine here. No, I need to import this. So get products, username, all that set up. So let's go back to my products page and set up my template. So for my products page, I'm putting the app login at the top so that if, it's going to show some extra information. So I'm going to change this. Instead of this just being one div here, I'm going to change it out. And I'm going to say, use my ngIf directive here and saying if the user is not logged in, then I'm going to show the login right on the top of my page there. But if they are logged in, then I'm just going to say user username is logged in. Another tag that I'm using that's unique to this page here is called ng-container. ng-container is useful when you don't want the element that something is used in appearing in the HTML once it gets generated. So ng-container is going to be something that's invisible if you do a view source. It won't be an HTML tag. Where if I were to make this a div, then you would see this div in the HTML. And there's cases where you might want this to show up, and there's cases where you might not. So for this, I'm using ng-container. So I think that's all of my login component that I need. Oh. One more thing. So when they log in, if it's successful, I'm setting the user logged in property on my data service to true and setting the username to what they put in as the username. Okay. It for login. Go back to here. That's my product. So user pass. Products works. Okay. What am I missing? No, not that one. Sorry, wrong copy paste. Okay, so in my products page, I'm now setting up an ng4. This is going to loop through my list of products and assigning for every loop. It's going to assign the current item in that array to a variable called product. And then within this, it's going to say name, display product.name, for quantity, product.quantity. And down here for button, click, I'm going to go to the show product details, passing in the product.id value into my method that's in the back end here. So show product details takes in an ID, and then it's going to navigate. And here's where I pass in that data that I want to send to a route. So I'm going to navigate to my product details page, passing in ID, giving it the value of what ID is. All right.
Also, this just in, Meg has decided to pass on the subscription. So Esther is our new winner.
All right. Congratulations, Esther. Okay. And let me give it some styling. So make this look a little bit better. My SCSS. Now this is the products.scss. So this can be associated only with the product component if you want. So if I want to have that style only available in this component, I can set what's called encapsulation. And there's a couple different options here. There's for view encapsulation. I can do emulated. I can do none, which makes these styles basically global. Or I can use a set shadow DOM. So if the browser actually does support shadow DOM, and that's all you need to support, you can actually say use the real shadow DOM, or you can do emulated. And what emulated does is when it generates the styles and the HTML, it'll use specific prefixes to the classes so that those only apply when the code is within that component. So I set that up there. Go back to my page. Now I have my products. I'm saying user is logged in because that's my username. And I have an array. So in this page, it looped through my product list and displayed all of these and gave me a details button. And if I hit details, that takes me over the product details page. And then at the end here, it says, you know, ID equals 3. We go back, click on a different one, ID equals 2. So that's all set up there. And let me quickly throw the product details page up. So the template is basically just going to show the name, quantity, and location. And in the component, this is one thing we haven't covered so far. How do I get that ID out of the URL so I can use it? So in the other pages, we use the router, but to get to the ID, we need to use this activated route. So I'm going to call that route. And so to get the property ID, I'm going to convert it into an int because it's going to come in as a string. So this.route and snapshot. So it's going to say instantaneously, you know, get a parameter map that's coming in and then tell me what the ID out of that parameter map is and put that into product ID. Then I'm taking that and I'm calling my data service saying, get me the product of that product ID and assign that to product. Okay. If they're not logged in, I'm going to log them, go back to the login page. This is just a very simple way to prevent people from getting certain pages. There's also a thing called, drawing a blank, route guards in Angular. So if you want to actually have the ability to block certain people or certain roles or whatever you want from getting to certain pages within Angular, look into route guards, and that'll set that up in your router table that we showed earlier. But right now I'm doing just a quick and dirty way to say, if they're not logged in, send them back to the login page. All right, so I think this should give me a final working product. Login, products page, details, name, quantity, location, aisle 3, product details. Hooray! Oh. All right, so I think that covers everything that I wanted to go through on, you know, the essentials, the ABCs of Angular. I do have a couple slides left that I'll show and continue on where I left off. Just a couple things, and then we'll be done. Yep, switch. Oh, this one, switch. There we go. So for performance in Angular, this I would consider non-performant. So if you're trying to show and hide something on one condition on multiple locations within a page, don't put an ngIf on every one of them. The best way to do that is surround them all with an ng container and then put the ngIf on the ng container rather than each one of those. Otherwise, every life cycle for Angular, it has to go through and do change detection and figure out how many different things does it need to show and hide. If you just put it in one location, it says, okay, everything within there, that's only 1 check versus 3 checks. The other way I talked about is if you surround things with a div and use the ngIf on that, then that div becomes part of the HTML, and that could potentially affect your styling. If your styling is not expecting these to be nested, that could affect that there. The other thing to really watch out for is don't have functions in your templates unless you really, really have to have them there. So if I were to put the squiggly brackets inside of a template, and then inside of that, I'm calling a function, passing it some value, that's going to get executed every time Angular does change detection. So change detection in Angular could be a mouse click, it could be a tab, it can be a key press. Every key press is going to fire that function. So if that function is slow and it takes a while, that could really start slowing down the browser and the machine. So watch out for that, especially in something like this that I'm doing on this next line. In ng4 out over something that's calling a function, especially if that function has to go out and hit an API endpoint. Every time somebody hits a key press, that function is going to get called. So don't do that. The best way to do it is if in the first case, use a pipe, because pipes will automatically cache things by default. There are ways to tell pipes not to be cacheable, but by default, you're going to make them cacheable. If you're going to get something from HTTP, get it only once, maybe in that ng on init function, and then in your template, call that cached variable that you stored all that in. So don't call that over and over again when you don't need to. All right. If you're using ng4, it's going to be tracking things by the object by default. If you want to be a little bit more for performance, you want to squeeze everything out of Angular, you can use what's called track by in saying that, you know, this element don't track it by the full object, track it by just this one property. So it's called track by, then colon, and then you give it a function to call for each element in that loop, that ng4. And down here, I'm calling track by ID. So track by ID takes in parameters index and the item, and then I'm going to return just the right item.id, because that's all I want Angular to track that iteration of the ng4 through. I only want it to worry about ID. I don't want it to worry about, in this case, name, address, phone, all of that. Makes it much more performant. And then things I didn't cover today, this is the rest, you know, this is ABC. Well, we got D to Z. That's talked about nesting routes. You can have lazy loading so that you can define your routes in different modules, and when you route to a certain page that calls for a different module, Angular will then only load the code for that module when it's needed. So it doesn't have to load your entire application all at once. It can load it piece by piece. I talked a little bit about route guards, template variables. This is something where if you just need to define something inside the template, you don't need to know about it within the class. You can assign that to be a variable in your template. There are other ways to do forms. I showed you template-based forms with ng model inside the banana in a box. There's also reactive forms. There's also form validation. So we didn't go into validating the form, but you can actually, if you use a template variable, you can write in the HTML, you can declare show an error if this is required and not filled out. You can show error messages if something is above or below the minimum values or length or things like that. So there's lots of things you can do with form validation. Change detection strategy. This is another performance tool. So if you want to know even more about performance, look at change detection strategy. And what that does is it says only check this component to be, if it needs to be updated, if something has actually been pushed into it through one of the constructor parameters or through an input or output variable. And I didn't get into input or output variables too, but that's ways to pass data in or out of your components. So you probably want to know how to do that. So out of these things on the list, the first things I would look up is look on input and output parameters. So that way on my component, I'll just show it real quick, because this is actually kind of important. So say my products detail component or my login component, since I already have something here. Maybe I need to pass something into it right when I declare it in the HTML. So I can declare something as an @input attribute and message. And input means over in my so like here on my product details page, if I wanted to send something into it, I can put it in square brackets and then pass that in. So let me go back to my demo product, refresh. Did it? Did it not recompile? Plug in. Oh, that's because I'm not showing the message here. This is just real key.
And Esther just asked if we're planning on another Angular meeting on some more advanced topics. We definitely can if there's interest in that. I'll be putting a survey out there. Our next 2 or 3 meetups are planned, or at least tentatively planned. So it would be a little ways out before that happens. And we are pretty close to time, or are we almost there with what you're trying to do?
I think, yeah, this is not being stored because I'm not putting this into the data service that I had. So, but this is how you can bring something into a component from the HTML where it's specified. So use the brackets here. And then if I did output, outputs use event emitters, and then I could have something this that outgoing emits, and then whatever I need to send back out to whatever that is. So you can do inputs and outputs, and I think testing much more, and I think that's my last slide. Yep. That is it. Thanks, everybody.
Well,
I hope you got something out of it. Yeah. I didn't talk too much about my podcast, but if you're interested in .NET podcasts, we've had a lot of really good guests on our show. We've had like Scott Hunter from Microsoft. We've had John Skeet. He's the top reputation person on Stack Overflow. We've had talks about Blazor. We've had a lot of talks about Azure and things like that. So if you're interested in checking out the podcast, it's at adventuresin.net. Just search for it on your podcast player of choice.
And I will say, Shawn, thank you so much for staying and presenting that. I know just from all of the questions we had a lot of interest here, and thank you to everyone who stayed till the end. I apologize for that glitch in the link. I do have just one final comment that looks like was just published over. Scott, looks like Phil answered. We have an OBS configuration, and I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the comments for the blog. Kevin, who who also does several of our meetups, has written 2 blogs on the subject on how to get that set up. You can actually do more than one presenter as well. So it actually, you can have several videos going at once. It's really a cool system, but I'll get that added right now for you. Any other comments before we say goodbye?
Kevin also has a live coding Twitch stream that he leverages that video configuration with.
Yes,
and,
yes.
and some green screens.
That in the comments as well too, because he is always showing new.
Shawn, thanks a lot, man. That was awesome. And apologize to you for having to, we threw you a few curveballs and dump some cold water on your head, that sort of stuff. So it's a great way to start a presentation. So thank you.
Yeah. There's a lot to go over. So, yep.
Oh, wait, we have 2 more comments before we go. Let me make sure. Oh, Jared says thanks, and so does Esther. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you next time with Stokes.